achieve and keep pushing forward.
I'm sure he will. Now, there's just a little tricky question. How come you got that funny haircut that the young kids have? Is there a reason for that?
He's got hair.
Actually, funny story. So we had the Supercars Gala dinner after Newcastle the other day. And I went to a barber for the first time, so I finally paid for a haircut. And I was watching the guy before who was getting. I was actually Ash Walsh, my Super 2 teammate. He was getting his haircut, so I'm taking notes as he's asking all these things. So he said all the same things and ended up with a line on the side of my head. So there we go.
You were such a clean boy, weren't you? Just out of blues, Simona, you seem to be on the track with her quite a, side by side, in front or behind with her quite a lot.
Where are you going with this, Graham?
No, not going anywhere. I think we probably all felt that with her international experience and her, remarkable ability, that she might have done a bit better. But you and she were. No, she found it hard work, didn't she? And now I don't know whether she got bullied because that sort of thing happens, or was she was able to stick up for herself, or.
Oh, look, I think she did. Well, she's probably arguably one of the best female drivers of that caliber come into our sport. I think you got to remember that she was finished on the podium in the IndyCar only a few years back, and she was test driving for Formula 1 a few years back as well. So you certainly can't take that away from anyone, and particularly Simona. So I think obviously she's got a lot of credentials. As we all know, I think if you watch the sport in supercars, it's a tough gig to be successful in, and whether it be from a team point of view or the equipment that's underneath you, or there's so many elements to get right and be successful in the sport, like any form of motorsport really. But whether or not that was one element that was holding her back, obviously, as you said, spent a few laps behind her or around her, and she was a menace to have in a rear vision mirror, I tell you that much. But she was a hard racer, and I'll give her that. And obviously she's now teaming up with, I think it's Porsche in the Formula E program next year, so she's got a pretty plumb drive to keep moving forward. But look, it was cool for supercars. Supercars being able to reap the rewards having a female in the sport. It's been good for the demographics, and I suppose trying to get a new element of people involved in our sport, which is what we want as a business and as a sport, to have new people getting invested in what we do. So it's been a good thing.
I just saw it as an indication of how hard it really is to break through that, whatever imaginary wall to get up there and running consistently in the top 10 or occasionally in the top 10.
Look, to be honest, even just to jag the top 10, for us, we finished however many races. I don't know how many races are in the championship this year. There's too many, but we finished in the top 10 3 occasions. Like out of all the races, and when you get in that top 10, it's like getting a race win. I tell you, like it's the biggest reward, because there's so many. Like in most days, motorsport, 80% pretty average, and then 10% are okay, and then 10% is really good, and you got to thrive off those wins. But particularly supercars, obviously there's massive, I suppose, different levels of teams and budgets and personnel and engineering. There's so many large gaps up and down pit lanes. Obviously, from our point of view, we're a single car team. We had 2 engineers, no team manager, 3 mechanics, 2 of them which were apprentices, and number 1 and 2 mechanics were apprentices. So those boys were thrown in the deep end. We had a crew chief, as opposed to you compare that to Penske. They got 50 odd people at the race meeting alone for 2 cars, let alone the engineering group, let alone the expertise of engineering that they've got. And then that's not even in putting in perspective all the resources and knowledge and everything else that comes from overseas. So obviously there's top end of town, bottom end of town, obviously with money and everything else. So for us to be able to compete and be racing against those guys was, for us, we felt like we could pat ourselves on the back, being able to achieve that at some times throughout the year. Obviously those, particularly the shell cars this year, they were certainly in a league of their own, and they did a very good job, and they're able to maximise every element to get the success that they got, and good on them for that. But hopefully in years to come there's going to be some really big rule changes coming in over the next 3 years, which I think is really going to shake up the Supercars Championship, and it's really going to hopefully get to the point where doesn't really matter if you've got a $10 million budget or a $2 million budget, you can still have a car that's going to be within half a second of the fastest car out on the track, which is, I think, it's quite ironic that we can still have that massive difference in budgets and allocations and whatever, but still have a category that's so close. Newcastle being a street circuit, minute and a half sort of lap time, it's still be only separated by 8/10 of a second over 24 cars is, I think, really impressive and a true testament to the product of our categories. So, and the level of drivers as well. We're all pushing really hard out there, and hopefully, next year we've got a controlled damper coming in, so we've got a locally made Super Shock damper that's going to be in every car next year. So all the valving, all the servicing work's all going to be controlled through Super Shock and supercars. So that's going to be a really big step forward, I think, to trying to bring even more equalisation towards the category, because that's, I think, at the moment one of the biggest areas that's separating the guys at the front to the back. And then there's a new...
Gary Rogers certainly thinks so.
Yeah, well, and that's a bit of a sad story as well, because that's the issue, is that you get teams that are consistently at the front winning all the time, and obviously that's diminishing for the smaller teams, because obviously it's very much a business, but it's a performance-based business. So you got to think of all, when you're at the front, it's very good because sponsors love you, everyone wants to work for the engineers, the drivers want to drive for you. If you're at the team at the bottom, no one wants to sponsor you, no one wants to drive for you. You only get them apprentices, and it's a tough gig to survive, and unfortunately that's where Gary was at a point where he had a major funding from Boost pull out underneath him. He essentially had the rug pulled out underneath him last minute, and that he had to make the tough call to call the quits, which was probably out of his control, unfortunately. But hopefully, as I said, with these new rule changes that are coming into supercars, I think it's with the Gen 3 program, we're going to have a control upright, which is probably the biggest room of engineering flexibility up and down pit lane. So it's going to be an element that's controlled. So it's going to save a lot of costs on R&D and engineering and the testing, and hopefully help the smaller teams to be able to be a bit more competitive and mix the results up, which is what everyone wants, I think.
So your expectations are nothing less than how you've always been for Brad Jones Racing. You reckon you can do it?
100%, yeah. Tim Slade, well, obviously I'm replacing for next year. He finished on the podium at Newcastle last race of the year, so it's actually quite weird being able to speak with those engineers now. I had a test day in the car, or did an evaluation day on Monday in the car, and here's a team I've been racing against all side by side all season, and then you literally walk into their workshop and they're telling you all their secrets, all their data, and you think, geez, this is a bit weird, it's only day one and they're telling me everything. It was quite weird, but yeah, really looking forward to the opportunity. As I said, they're a big team, they've got a fantastic group of engineers. I feel like they've got a great car. I obviously, as I said, drove the car and they've got some really strong points in the car that I feel is going to be quite strong next year, and I think with the controlled damper coming in as well, it's going to be a big shot in the arm for Brad Jones Racing come 2020. So hopefully when I'm sitting here next year, we've got an even bigger smile on our face talking about an even better year.
Well, let's hope so. Living in Albury?
It's a bit cold. Look, I don't know. Yeah, obviously made the big call a few years ago to move up to Queensland and go sit on the beach and sip my latte and ride my push bike around all day. But no, it's been good. Obviously living in Queensland, I lived 10 minutes from the workshop and essentially lived there for the last 5 years at the Mattstone Racing Workshop. So for me, living in Queensland now and not having to go to the workshop is actually quite a weird feeling. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet. So my lease finishes up in March. So Brad's words were, I don't really give a stuff where you live next year, as long as you're fit and healthy and you're there for pre-briefs and debriefs. But from my point of view, I always feel that you get more out of the opportunity if you are hands-on with the team, and even if it's just literally going in there every day and annoying the engineers and coming up with the odd idea over lunch or a coffee, and it's just those little conversations that when it comes race day, you're fully prepared. You've spoken about more ideas than any other driver up and down pit lanes. So I think that's what helps you get the most out of it. So yeah, we'll see what happens, but nothing locked in yet.
We've all run out of questions.
Really? That's
Well, I'd like to couple up, but look. Questions. Alan, have you got a question, or are you just saying there's 2 minutes to go, or was that a rude signal?
You know if it was rude. A couple of questions for you, Todd. First one, you said you just driven Slade's car. Did it feel different?
Yeah, massively different actually. Yeah, it's quite a different driving style to get the most out of the car. So
Can you-
obviously for me this year I've been driving what is a customer spec 888 based car. So obviously you see the likes of Whincup and Shane Van Gisbergen are driving. For me that's something similar to what I was driving. There's a few little elements on the car that are a little bit different to those guys. Obviously that's how those guys can stay superior to the customer teams that they support. But yeah, definitely the way the front end works in the Brad Jones car is a lot different, has a lot more turn, a lot more aggressively in the mid-corner, whereas the 888's a bit lazy in the mid-corner, but it's got very good drive. So there's a few little things I have to get my head around over the off-season, but it was, fortunately, Brad Jones, as I said, they had an evaluation day on Monday, so they literally had guys from Super 2 and Super 3 driving the cars, so a couple of kids out of Formula Ford as well, and the way the rules are written, you can have a supercar driver do 10 laps. So I had my 10 laps in the car to work out how to drive this thing and yeah, have plenty to think about over Christmas.
Is it likely you'll be driving that particular car in 2020?
It's not locked in just yet. I know they're building a new chassis for Nick Percat, so whether or not there's a chassis reshuffle within the team, I'm not sure, but essentially the chassis are all identical. There's never really any sort of issue. The only time you see a difference between chassis is essentially the parts that are bolted on it. And obviously with a big team of 4 cars, it's sometimes hard to have everything developed at the same rate, obviously because there's only so much you can machine up in a couple of weeks in between race meetings. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting year, but yeah, no doubt whatever I get will be a good package.
I'm sure it will. Stuart Ennis.
Thank you, Graham. Todd, the car you got this year was, as you mentioned, a 888 car from last year, 2018, which I think Whincup won a few races in. And I think also they were there when you had your first private test, and Whincup was there and a few other engineers. Did that support carry on? Was that part of the deal that you got good support from 888 through this year? Or did they say, here's your car and see you later?
No, that's a good question. So yeah, for us in 2019, we actually signed up to become a customer team to 888. So essentially paying for their engineering and support team to help us throughout the season. So it started with the test stage. So it was actually this time last year, I got to drive the car for the first time. So they literally took the car from Newcastle, set the car up for a customer spec. So they got a few different specs for roll bars and a few other points, pickup points on the suspension arms and things like that. So there's a few little different elements. They've got a control valving that they do for the customers as well. So all our shocks are managed by 888 as a customer spec. So yeah, got first taste of the car. Now throughout the season, they let us know of any updates available. So obviously then we were required to obviously purchase and try and keep up with those guys throughout the year. We get access to some of their data throughout the year as well. So with the customer program, they give us like a base setup of what they're going to start the weekend with, and then they share it with us, and then we can work off that. But obviously, it's good to have that information as a bit of a backup, but there's actually quite a large difference between how Jamie drives the car, how Shane drives the car, and how I drive the car. So you can't solely rely on what those guys are doing, because at the end of the day, I'm a different driver to those 2 guys. And it doesn't matter how much you try and drive to a one setup, there's always going to be small differences at certain circuits. So we very much try to row our own boat, so to speak, with our own setups throughout the year, and I feel like it paid off probably 80% of the time. There was some events throughout the year we actually out-qualified the 888 guys, and the only times they actually were able to beat us was through strategy and pit stops, not through actual racecraft, or not through actual lap speed itself. So that was a bit of a pep in our step to be able to achieve that. Obviously with the resources that those boys have got compared to us was pretty cool, and caused a bit of an upset with those boys. But that's the beauty of the relationship for them as well, is that obviously they're getting our information post-event as well. So essentially for them, with us being a customer program, with Team 18, with Mark Winterbottom also being a customer program, essentially a 4-car team. So although they're helping us, we're also helping them in return as well. And there was a lot of instances this year where we actually have the opportunity to be able to debrief with Mark Dutton, who's the team manager there, and sit down with him and work out what worked for us, what didn't, and ultimately trying to steer the whole team forward, because if they're going faster, that helps us, and it's a win-win for everyone.
But one out of the 4 cars up quickest lap times, generally.
Look, between Jamie and Shane, it's one or the other basically. They're at such a high level. They're the ultimate professionals, the way they drive and how they set up the cars. It's pretty impressive. Yeah. Mark?
Thanks, Graham. Todd, are we going to see any new manufacturers coming through in the next 5 years? 2 years, whatever.
Yeah, I think in the next 4 years it will. It's definitely, with the way the current rules are written, you definitely won't see any new manufacturers come in, just simply because it costs way too much to get a new car into the category, obviously develop a motor, and obviously that those teams are relying on the manufacturer to bring a big chunk of money to be able to put up the costs and make it all happen. And obviously we saw that with Nissan, and unfortunately that was a bit of a sad story, because supercars probably didn't support Nissan enough when they come into the category. They were well supported. Nissan were wanting to be involved in supercars, but there was a few grey areas that supercars were making it really hard for Nissan to ever be successful. And unfortunately, we saw them out of the sport at the end of last year, which is, I think, a big loss to the category. But I think with the Gen 3 rules that are coming in, so it's going to be completely different design in the roll cage. It's going to be a big crackdown on how the motors are done, because that's the issue at the moment. There's no reason why we should have a pushrod V8 making 640 horsepower that costs $120,000. You know, like it's absolutely crazy in this current climate. So there needs to be some big key changes from a cost point of view to make it more attractive for manufacturers to come in. I know there's a big push from a couple of teams. Obviously, we saw an article that came out this week with Walkinshaw linked to BMW. And I think, you know, if anyone could ever bring a manufacturer in, I think it's probably that team, because they've got the facility to be able to manage that sort of program. And whether or not it might be Jaguar or whoever. So I think there's a couple key manufacturers that are on the brink of coming into the sport, but the sport's probably not, the way the rules are currently written, aren't really accommodating for the manufacturer to step up. So yeah, hopefully in 4 years' time we might see a few more fresh faces.
So they're not going to get Mark Scafield on the next...
No. Yeah. Thank God.
Just before we wind up, parity. Do you have anything to say about parity in 2019? Make yourself comfortable? No.
Oh, look, it's been an interesting year using the LP word this year, that's for sure. It's been a pretty dirty word in supercars, and obviously there's been plenty of controversy around that element. But probably the simplest way to explain the whole situation, obviously we saw the Mustang come in, instantly successful, and you know, to all the team's credits, they did a great job, and Penske, obviously, they pumped in a hell of a lot of money to be able to be at that level in the first place. But the way I look at it, it's the first time supercars ever homologated a two-door car in a four-door championship. So obviously there was always going to be hurdles that they had to manage. And then obviously with the big outcry that happened last year with the ZB Commodore coming in, there was a bit of politics involved. So then Ford Australia were pulling a handbrake on supercars, and then there was a bit of backlash going on there. So yeah, if you want to talk about politics for an hour and a half, I can go right ahead and get into the nitty and gritty. But yeah, it's been a bit of a bad year for the sport. Obviously what we saw at Bathurst, and then when we saw the result with the qualifying motor and things like that, with that, it's never a good look for us as the sports people and as teams and as an industry. So yeah, hopefully, you know, the way I look at it, there was two new technical directors that come into the sport at the start of this year after the car was homologated. They saw the issues. There was definitely some clear flaws with how the cars were homologated in the last year, which is why we saw the cars so superior this season. And don't get me wrong, I'm not taking anything away from those teams that, you know, won races this year and did a great job. You know, it's very tough to be at that level, but those cars definitely had quite a clear advantage for some time this season. But don't get me wrong, I'm a Ford man at heart, so it takes a lot for me to say that. But you know, being on the other side of the fence and seeing the actual data is, at the start of the year, was quite scary, knowing what could have been capable. And then the issue was that they weren't going to change the Mustang because of the politics involved. So that's when we actually saw the updates constantly coming into the Nissan and the Holden, trying to bridge that gap, because essentially Ford weren't allowing supercars to touch the cars and bring it back to how it should be. So that's actually created a whole new level of issues for the championship, because we've got so much downforce on the cars now. It's making it so hard to race, and it's making the racing a bit stale. So hopefully they're actually doing an aero test as we speak. That's been going on for a week now. So that's currently being done at the moment. So hopefully next year there's meant to be a 12 to 15% reduction in downforce. The way I look at it, that'll probably reduce it back to how it was last year. So it's not massively different, but yeah, hopefully for the sport's sake, it's a lot better moving forward.
We can only hope. Look, Keith has a little presentation that he'd like to effect, but at the same time, we'd just like to acknowledge the support of Todd's parents who work day and night and in between to keep this thing happening. Congratulations. Thank you, Todd. Now, Keith is creeping up here. I know he's going to hit you with this mug or...
He's going to glass me.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, mate.
Cheers. See you next time.
You will.